From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's coming up. K-State's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz will talk about anhydrous ammonia applications to corn and sorghum ground here in the fall, which he still endorses despite the extraordinarily high fertilizer prices right now. Included in that discussion, the value of nitrification inhibitor additives. Also, on the latest edition of FSA Coffee Talk, Todd Barrows of the Farm Service Agency will share details on the new USDA program feature, which provides cost assistance for livestock feed transportation when feed availability has been complicated by drought. And on this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Lynn Loughary will offer some ideas on enhancing the winter home landscape. All that right here on this Agriculture Today. Thanks for joining us again for another Agriculture Today. Well, this time of the year, we talk with you corn and grain sorghum producers about putting down nitrogen fertilizer in advance of that next crop here in the fall. There is an added wrinkle or two this year when talking about anything concerning crop fertilization, and we're going to weave that into this discussion now with Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz, who is a crop nutrient specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Dorivar, you're hearing it from producers, and you're having conversations with them and others about the sky-high, to say the least, price tag on fertilizer in general, anhydrous in specific right now. What kind of discussions are you having with producers out there on this?
Yes, Eric, obviously a lot of uncertainty regarding the price of fertilizer and nitrogen in particular. And so there's a lot of things to think about in terms of how we can perhaps try to take advantage of a little bit more flexibility in terms of application timings and methods and looking at sources. I think we need to consider all of those options and certainly try to take advantage of maybe some opportunities if we have. Overall, of course, again, with the high prices, we're trying to look for that advantage to maximizing nitrogen use efficiency, minimizing losses, and really getting the maximum yield benefit for every pound of nitrogen that we are applying out there.
Producers may be asking several questions, and one of those may be, should the producer wait until next spring for their entire nitrogen application to corn or grain sorghum ground and hope for a retraction in those prices?
Yes, and that's one of the questions. And obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty there. We don't know what the price is going to do for next spring. We do have some, obviously, good information on what's happening today and what kind of decisions we can make this fall. And so this is where perhaps looking at fall application is one alternative. Obviously, there's a lot of benefits generally with fall apply anhydrous ammonia. One of those is just more flexibility time-wise and considering the busy time of the spring. But this year in particular, perhaps just getting the better information on prices and, again, availability of anhydrous ammonia this fall as well may be something that we should consider for conditions where fall application will be ideal.
To the ground rules, then, if you will, for putting down anhydrous in the fall. And the trigger point is soil temperature, or it should be, you say.
Yes, and this is one thing that we need to look very closely. If we think about anhydrous ammonia in the fall, again, it is a good system for many of our soils across Kansas. But there are a few things that we need to keep in mind. And the main one is usually soil temperature. We have to think about what happens to anhydrous when we apply to the soil. Typically, that anhydrous ammonia basically convert quickly to ammonium. The ammonium form is pretty stable. Usually, we will not lose that nitrogen there once it's in the soil. But then the next step, that conversion of ammonium to nitrate, is really the one that we need to watch very closely. Because as we know, nitrate, we can lose that nitrogen by leaching, denitrification, different ways of losing that nitrate. So the idea here is really to keep that nitrogen in the ammonium form the longest possible until the corn is taken up next spring. And so that's one of the key aspects we need to keep in mind. Now, that process of ammonium to nitrate conversion is a microbial-driven process. So obviously, temperature is going to play a key role here in terms of that conversion. The higher that microbial activity, the faster it's going to be the conversion, and then for the higher the risk of losing that nitrogen. So then going back to soil temperature, we usually think about a temperature of about 50 degrees or lower. About 4-inch depth is what we like to see. Once you get to that temperature, that microbial activity is going to slow down significantly. And at that point, essentially, that anhydrous application will stay stable there over the winter months and into the spring. And most of that ammonium will be in the ammonium form and obviously with very low risk of nitrogen losses next spring.
Now, that 50-degree temperature at the 4-inch depth. Some places in Kansas we might be there, but others we're not yet, right?
Yes, and this is what we need to monitor. We do have obviously the advantage in Kansas of looking at having the network of weather stations where we do have soil temperature information, the Mesonet, so we can be checking at that temperature. Parts of the state, in the northern part of the state, we are getting close, I would say, the last couple of days, but we're still not quite there. Usually the number that we like to see is really the average of the last 7 days. Because as we know, temperatures will continue to, up and down and perhaps increase in the next few days. So we really like to see the average going down in the last 7 days. And so again, we are getting close in the northern part of the state. In the central and southern part of the state, we're still above 50. And if we think about historical values, historical numbers, in central Kansas, we typically get to that temperature closer to mid-November, perhaps November 20th. In that range, we tend to get to that temperature versus, again, the northern part of the state where usually early November we start to get to that temperature.
If a producer is wanting to get after it, though, soil temperatures are still a little warmer than ideal for this purpose. There is at least one step they can take to reduce the potential for nitrification, isn't there?
Yes, and this is one of the questions that's very common this year. Again, producers that perhaps already have anhydrous available and perhaps better price and they need to do the application earlier. One of the common questions is, what can we do? Can we still apply perhaps anhydrous even if temperature is not quite there? And one of the alternatives is to use nitrification inhibitors. This is one alternative, additives essentially that can help us to slow down that microbial activity process. And so this is basically going to hopefully buy us some time until that temperature really goes below 50 and the microbial activity slow down. So that's one alternative. We're really thinking about going a little bit earlier. I will definitely encourage the use of nitrification inhibitor just to minimize that potential risk of losing that nitrogen. Again, thinking about the prices and so on, the last thing we want is to put that nitrogen at risk, essentially, of losses.
Now, that nitrification inhibitor is not a silver bullet in certain circumstances if one thinks about the soil texture they're working with.
That's a very good point, Eric, and we need to keep that in mind because, again, this is really just essentially a small help that we're going to get to buy a little bit of time in some of those soils, especially soils that are going to be, more medium texture, fine texture soils where the risk of losing nitrogen also tends to be lower. Now, if we're talking about sandy soils with high risk of nitrogen leaching and potential losses, typically we will not recommend fall anhydrous application, again, just because of that high risk of nitrogen losses. And typically, again, a lot of the losses will happen early in the spring, and again, those sandy soils typically will not hold that nitrogen, even if we're using nitrification inhibitors. So that will be one situation that we will not recommend any fall anhydrous application, and we should be looking at either spring application or other sources and timing of nitrogen for that type of situation.
And you mentioned, again, spring nitrification. That will happen. That's a reality of fall applications. Again, it's back to the timing, though, as to whether that's significant or not, right?
Yes. And this is something that's a good point. We will see nitrification happening in the spring, and the key point here is how much of the ammonium is left for that nitrification in the spring. In other words, we don't want any nitrification to happen in the fall and winter months. We want to watch that soil temperature, make sure we apply after the temperature is low enough so we don't have any conversion. And so any conversion that happens in the spring will be minimum. And again, trying to get most of that nitrogen to the corn when it's needed.
Incidentally, there's a great Agronomy E-Update newsletter article on this topic of anhydrous ammonia applications in the fall ahead of corn and grain sorghum. You can see that in the most recent Agronomy E-Update newsletter this past Thursday, the 28th of October at agronomy.ksu.edu. But Dorivar, any parting thoughts to producers on navigating these unbelievably high fertilizer prices as we're looking to the next growing season?
That's a good question, Eric, and certainly my suggestion is to really try to take advantage of every pound of nutrients that we are applying out there. And again, thinking about efficiency, thinking about having good information like, for example, soil testing and knowing how much we have already there. Taking advantage of that is all of those are going to be adding up to essentially try to take advantage of that fertilizer that we apply. On the other hand, also we have to keep in mind that grain prices are also higher, so we have to be careful not to cut back on rates significantly because we've seen this situation before, and when we cut back rates, typically, obviously, we're cutting back yields as well, and that is a situation we don't want to have if all possible.
Keep that well in mind. It's going to be an interesting 2022 in our crop production in Kansas, and this situation is going to add to that, to be sure. Dorivar, thank you for coming over, as always.
Thank you.
Crop nutrient specialist Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz, K-State Research and Extension, with some guidelines there once more on fall-applied anhydrous ammonia to row crop ground in advance of this next growing season. You're tuned to Agriculture Today. We'll be back with more on the K-State Radio Network. Agriculture Today is back now, as is from the Farm Service Agency, state headquarters for Kansas, Farm Program Chief Todd Barrows. This is our regular installment of FSA Coffee Talk here on the program. And Todd, good to have you back here and to cover an assortment of things, and one of which has to do with reporting certain information about one's farming operation here fairly promptly. Fill us in, if you would.
Yeah, Eric, hey, it's always good to be back on Coffee Talk and sit down with you and the listeners and discuss what's happening not only within our agency but across our rural America and across the state of Kansas. As I've traveled here lately, it seems like the mood is state of change. And so I was thinking, whether we're in the change of seasons, we're in the change of crop year. And so with that train of thought, I thought today might be the perfect time just to talk briefly about producers needing to review their farm operating plans, their farm structures, on how they're conducting business to make sure that how they're doing business today marries up or matches what we have on record in FSA.
Share some examples of that kind of information that the FSA needs to have in hand.
So we would ask a producer a couple common questions would be, have you purchased or sold land as compared to what you owned or operated during the 2021 crop year? Did your land lease or rent structure stay the same as compared to crop year 2021? Or if you're operating as an entity, are the members or stockholders in that entity still the same as they were then? If any of this is has changed, then you need to come in and update your farm operating records and farm operating plans. Because the important thing is, as we're changing into the new 2022 program and crop year, we don't want you to jeopardize risking missing out on some all-important benefits that you may be due and eligible for because your records are not up to date.
It's a simple process, really, but it's something that should not be overlooked. So be sure that you keep your Farm Service Agency local office fully in tune with any farm changes that have occurred on your operation. Todd, we always like to ask you about any fresh word on new programs that the FSA might be administering to assist producers. What have you, if anything?
We have one, Eric, that's coming out. We haven't started yet. It has been announced, but there is not a starting date, and I want to make that clear. It has not announced a starting date as of today. However, our county office staff is currently being trained this week on this new program, and it falls under the Emergency Livestock Assistance Program, or you might hear it being referred to as the ELAP umbrella, and it will provide cost assistance for livestock feed transportation costs where the county fell under an eligible drought condition. So we're looking at the physical location county if it fell into a drought situation.
The finer details are being hammered out, we understand, but have you any particulars that you know about as of yet?
We're getting, as I said, we're getting trained on that this week. There are some details that are starting to get leaked out. The first thing is I want to make known that this program will be retroactive back to this past grazing year or the 2021 grazing season. And then also we know that eligibility is going to hinge on the U.S. Drought Monitor. And you had to have loss of grazing stocks or grazing feed stuff because of an eligible drought condition. So when we look at an eligible drought condition, we're going to use, as I stated, the U.S. Drought Monitor, and it's going to consist of at least a D2, which we consider a severe drought intensity for at least 8 consecutive weeks, or a D3 extreme drought or D4 exceptional drought affecting those grazing lands during the grazing season. And again, that's the key point. It has to be occurred during the grazing season. This program is designed to help with additional costs incurred to transport livestock feed or feedstuffs for additional mileage above what you would normally transport it. This is in excess of 25 miles, which they consider those local mile travel, not to exceed 1,000 miles for purchased livestock feed per load. And the program only pays on loaded miles. It does not pay on empty or unloaded miles.
It can lend some important assistance here, and what do producers need to think about when applying for this then?
Yeah, in fact, we do have a tool out there on our website, USDA farmers.gov, which producers can begin accumulating the data necessary, which they'll need to do when they apply for this program and it's announced. And that's going to be what it's looking at, or what it's going to be asking you for is, as a producer, you would have to, if you fall in an eligible county, then you would certify to the number of truckloads of livestock feed hauled in a normal year plus your normal mileage of trucking or transportation compared to the number of truckloads of livestock feed hauled in the 2021 grazing season and that mileage, the mileage that incurred.
Important that the calculation tools are already in place and producers who qualify can employ those right away. You are still up in the air on the dates for applying for this, though?
Yeah, we are, Eric, and we do not have a start date at this time, but honestly, I would anticipate that to be announced very soon since, as I mentioned, our staff is receiving the training this week on the program. We do know, though, that the deadline for submitting an application or notice of loss for this program is going to be January the 30th of 2022. We don't have a start date, but I anticipate it very soon. We do know an end date will be January the 30th of 2022.
Again, that pertains to the cost assistance for livestock feed transportation under the overall Emergency Livestock Assistance Program. Be watching for the specifics on that out of your local FSA once more. Any other program deadlines that producers need to be aware of at this point, Todd?
Yeah, while I was here, Eric, I thought I'd just take the opportunity to, most importantly, remind producers of the importance of timely reporting their fall seeded crops for the 2022 crop year. So when we're talking about fall seeded, we're mainly looking at our small grains, which would include wheat, triticale, but it also could include some cover crops, and those would have a final reporting date to be timely certified of December the 15th here in 2021, so roughly 45 more days. What producers need to keep in mind when they report these crops to FSA, they'll be asked to identify the area that was planted on an aerial photography, and then they'll also be requested to certify the acres planted, the practice, which would be the irrigated versus non-irrigated, who shares in that crop or who shares in the risk of growing the crop, and then the date in which the crop was planted or seeded. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention, additionally, FSA is currently enrolling producers under the 2022 program year ARC PLC program, and they have till March the 15th of 2022 to finalize those plans. But just so you know, if you wanted to report your acres by December the 15th, and while you're in the office, we can also take your application enrollment for the 2022 ARC PLC program.
Mainly, though, don't lose sight of that December the 15th deadline for those fall-seeded crops, because that will sneak up on us faster than we'd think. So all important reminders for our producers out there. Anything else you need to pass along?
Eric, I would just say in closing, just want to take this moment to remind our producers, as I started off our conversation by saying, change is inevitable. It is a part of life. Yep. And I assure you, all the producers, FSA is working diligently, not only in Kansas but across rural America, to provide efficient program delivery during these challenges that we are facing, in particular with the COVID-19 and other challenges. And I would want to leave with one other thought as we close this section of Coffee Talk is a couple of quotes that I ran across recently, and I think they're inspiring to me, and hopefully the listeners will find them inspiring, and that is, what does not challenge you does not change you, and don't limit your challenges, challenge your limits. And so FSA is looking at that as how can we more effectively and efficiently meet the producer's needs.
So much of this is in communication with your local FSA folks. So have those conversations on any program matters, whether they be among those we talked of today or otherwise. That's always a good visit with your local FSA staff. Todd, Thank you, as always.
Absolutely, Eric. It's great to sit down and visit with you, and appreciate you having us.
Absolutely. Appreciate you being by. Todd Barrows from the Farm Service Agency State Headquarters for Kansas. He is the Farm Program Chief there. We'll be back with more for you. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Agriculture Today is back now, and it is time once more for our weekly horticulture segment. Yesterday, the Department of Horticulture at K-State hosted its final K-State Garden Hour webinar of the series for this year, and the focus of that presentation was on creating winter interest in the home landscape. That's an intriguing concept, and we're going to ask the presenter of that webinar to clarify it for us. Lynn Loughary is with us via phone. She's the Wyandotte County Extension horticulture agent. Lynn, when thinking of winter landscaping, one might believe that the options are limited here, but you're suggesting something to the contrary.
Absolutely. We're so hard up for any kind of pleasure in the winter that we decorate with Halloween lights now. We, of course, have all kinds of Christmas lights on the exterior of our properties, but we can also add different plant materials that give year-round interest. That may be color, it may be movement, it may be texture, and, of course, we don't want to forget about our furry friends, wildlife.
Right.
So those are some concepts we want to keep in our minds.
We get into those principles, color, texture, so forth. There is plant material that suits the need here, you say. Give us some examples.
Okay, so when I think about what makes plant materials appealing, I look at what kind of bark do our plants have. Is it peeling or exfoliating? Do the branches have twisty habits? And an example of that would be the walking stick that a lot of people will grow that has contorted stems, and it's called Harry Lauder's walking stick. And so it's a great plant. Doesn't look like much in the summertime, but when it drops the leaves and it leaves behind the contorted branches and the hanging catkins, which is the seed from it, then you've got a really intriguing plant. Of course, we're all familiar with plants that have berries for the birds. And pyracantha is an old standard that people have planted for years. But there's all kinds of plants that have berries. Cotoneasters, a lot of our crab apples hold on to those fruits throughout the winter. Beautyberry, another great plant, particularly for those of us who love K-State because it has brilliant purple berries on it.
One can create more texture in the absence of brilliant color because that's what we tend to lack in the wintertime. That's the idea here, Lynn?
Yes. Matter of fact, a lot of our ornamental grasses, we go down the Konza Prairie highways, we will see lots of color from the native grasses, and you'll see the seed heads blowing in the wind. Well, we can bring that same type of attribute into our landscapes to bring texture and movement.
Where does one go to seek out this kind of plant material? There are catalogs out there undoubtedly and such, but is there a clearinghouse of information on this?
Well, first off, you want to stop by your extension office. We have lists of plants that are well adapted for Kansas. And I would start with your local nursery or garden center. Plants that grow within, 100 miles of your property are the best to buy. Not something from Florida, not something from California, because oftentimes those plants are not adapted to our climate. So go local.
But, Lynn, the main thing is that you're trying to orient folks in this direction. Don't give up on their landscape enjoyment in the winter season. There are things that they can do.
There are a lot of things, and I have talked about over 25 different genuses and species that you can add to your landscape to give it that winter appeal.
By the way, you can also refer to the recording of that K-State Garden Hour webinar, which took place this past Wednesday. Go to the K-State Horticulture website for that, or simply search for K-State Garden Hour online. Lynn, a pleasure to visit with you briefly here. Thanks for passing along these approaches.
Thank you.
Lynn Loughary, Wyandotte County Extension Horticulture Agent, on this week's Horticulture segment. And that closes out our Thursday edition. We appreciate you tuning in. Please rejoin us here tomorrow. And until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.